All right. Good morning and welcome to our session, Collecting and Using Feedback on Mass.gov. I'm Joe Galluccio, a product manager at Mass.gov.
I'm Colin Panetta. I'm the director of UX UI at Last Call Media. We partnered with Mass.gov on the project we'll be discussing today. So we're going to be talking about feedback. How many people here have left feedback on a website? A lot of people. How many people have left positive feedback on a website? Less people.
Bless you.
Not bad. Some people not sure.
Once in my whole life.
Cool. Getting people to do this is an interesting challenge and something we'll be talking about today.
Cool. So today we'll be talking about, as Colin mentioned, we're going to be talking about how we designed and built a page-based feedback component on the Mass.gov website and how we get feedback to our authors. And we'll end with some of the lessons that we learned along the way. Let's start by talking a little bit about Mass.gov. So Mass.gov is Massachusetts' web front door. It's one single large Drupal site that's shared by over 100 state organizations. The site has informational content only, and what I mean by that is that the state government transactional applications live on separate domains, and we link to them from Mass.gov. Our site runs on Drupal 8 and was launched in the fall of 2017. So it's a really large and busy site. We host over 45,000 pages and 150,000 documents for the organizations that are as varied as Registry of Motor Vehicles, Department of Public Health, Department of Conservation and Recreation, and the State Police. And we have a large number of authors throughout state government, more than 500 authors who create and manage content for their organizations. And we get lots of traffic. We get about 15 million page views per month, and over 3 million visitors per month. And at Mass.gov, we want to continually improve the website, and one of the ways that we do that is by getting feedback from the public and getting it to our authors who can make improvements to the site. And when you have so many pages and so many authors, this is a really hard thing for us to do. Let me give you a high-level view of our feedback process. So this is a lot like any iterative process. Feedback comes in from our constituents. We measure performance based on that feedback, and our authors review the feedback. And when appropriate, authors will reach out to individual constituents. Authors will then make improvements to the pages, and also the central team at Mass.gov will work to make site-wide improvements. And we use several tools and methods to gather this feedback. We have a three-pronged strategy to get this feedback. We think all these are important, and if we did just one or two of these, I think we'd be missing the mark. I'll talk briefly about the first two on the left, and then we'll focus on page-based feedback, which is on the right. So we want to make sure that what we build works best for the public, and we want to have a direct way to reach out and get the public to help us design what works best for them. And for this, we have a user panel. This is a group of people who have volunteered to help us test the website. We have about 800 people on our user panel, and we do both open-ended user testing where we aren't sure what we'll learn, and we also do focused user testing when we're trying to see how something very specific will work. We also collect site-based feedback using a third-party tool called 4C. It's used on a lot of websites to measure customer satisfaction, and it gives us a customer satisfaction score and also gives us verbatim feedback from visitors. Okay, so the main topic of today's session is page-based feedback. This form appears, good, it's big enough on the screen, I was worried about that. This form appears below the main content of every page except for our home page. And Colin's now going to talk about requirements and design.
So I'm going to talk about a project where we developed the current iteration of this feedback component. And so we started with figuring out what we need to know to improve pages. And so we needed to know whether or not users found what they were looking for on the page and what that was that they were looking for. We wanted to contextualize that information by knowing how satisfied they are with the page and what they came with the site what they came to the site to do. That might seem slightly redundant, but if you think about a situation where someone says that the thing that they came, the thing that they couldn't find on the page was like the contact information for the RMV, then it's still very helpful to know that the thing that they came to look for was that they're trying to renew their license. And we also want very detailed feedback that could only be provided through our user panel, through extended conversations with users. We also conducted stakeholder interviews. It's always important to gather as many diverse, relevant perspectives as you can to make sure your product is well-rounded and works for its intended audience. We seldom walk away from interviews without at least one crucial improvement. For this project, we conducted interviews with site authors, so they're one of the primary audiences for this feedback. They're one group who is seeing and acting on it, and we wanted to make sure that we were getting the information that they needed and to get their perspective on how to optimize the forum for their audience. The thing we heard most often speaking to them was that the key to getting responses through the forum was to keep it as brief as possible. We would show them things and they would say, "That's too many words. No one's gonna do all that." We also discovered that state organizations have diverse communication methods in how they can respond to user feedback. Well, even before that, actually, they told us that feedback was being submitted with the expectation of a response. And so they wanted to be able to respond. People were submitting feedback saying, "I can't find this thing, can you help me find it?" And there was no mechanism through which we could respond to them, or the site authors could respond to them. So not only did we want to establish a line of communication there, but different organizations had different ways they wanted to communicate with people. So combining all that together with some of our best practices gave us our requirements. We didn't want to overwhelm users, like site authors told us. They spook easily. We wanted to make it easy for the public to use, as always. Mobile and desktop friendly, make sure it works on whatever device people are using to access it. Make it accessible, make sure it's usable by everyone. We wanted to gather the feedback we need, that feedback that I detailed before. We wanted to make sure it was available on almost all pages. The only page in the site that it's not available on is the home page. We wanted to make it, once we had the feedback, we wanted to make it easy for authors to use that information. We wanted a high response rate. We wanted to make sure we were hearing from as many people as possible. We wanted to make it so that urgent issues that were submitted through the feedback form could be intercepted. That's another thing we heard from authors about that I'll talk about more in a minute. And we wanted to allow those different response options for different organizations, as I said. So having all that in place, I'll talk about the design that we came up with. Our first thought, once we had all these requirements gathered, was that that is a lot. If presented all at once, the feedback component would be pretty tall, probably taller than a lot of our pages. And so, again, as site authors told us, we don't want to scare users away by showing them too much at once. So in order to maximize the amount of responses we get, we decided to lower the effort for submission by presenting these options one at a time, starting with the step that takes the least amount of commitment and increasing with each step. So users can submit a little bit of feedback and then opt into submitting a little bit more and then keep going. More accurately, the staircase would have kind of like multiple pathways, as there are a few different variations of the feedback component, mostly depending on how an organization wants to respond to feedback. And we'll take note of those as we review the component. So this is how this would appear on any page of the site. This is just a page on the site. And every page has a sticky feedback tab on the side, so users are able to decide to leave feedback at any time. Clicking on that tab scrolls you to the bottom of the page, seen here, which houses the feedback component. But you can also get here just by scrolling normally. So here's an isolated view of that same feedback component. This initial load state is very simple. Users see only a question asking if they found what they're looking for. Once they select yes or no, the component extends to show users the next step, which is a field where they can give more information. Here is a variation that's similar to what we just saw, but includes a notice instructing users not to submit sensitive information through this form, and giving them a different path where they can do so. So like I said, this was another thing we heard from site authors, was that there was some urgent and sensitive information being submitted through this form. And so we wanted to get those people where they need to go as soon as possible for their important issues. Site authors told us that this notice needs to be impossible to miss, so we made it bright yellow. And it's also dismissible by the user. So if you're not one of those users, you can dismiss this. Below that input field, users will see one of two variations depending on whether a response to their feedback is possible. Here, a response is possible. If they hit no, then nothing happens. But if they do elect to receive a response, an area where they can enter their contact information will appear. And also a little field above that sets an expectation of what type of communication this is going to be, how soon they're going to hear back from someone. The second variation here occurs when a direct response to the feedback is not possible. Here we set the expectation that this feedback will not receive a response, and users can get a little more information about why through that accordion right there that just elaborates very briefly on that this is a feedback form and this is only used to gather feedback about the site. Whenever possible, in this situation, users will have the opportunity to contact the organization responsible for this page after submitting their feedback, which you'll see soon. Once users have submitted that feedback, there are a couple of different variations of what could happen. Here, users are thanked for their feedback. Site authors told us that they wanted users to understand that they were reading the feedback that was being submitted, so we named the organization here. This variation is similar, but provides a link to contact information. This occurs when a direct response to feedback is not possible through the previous screen, but the organization that owns the page has a web page dedicated to their preferred communication channel. So in this case, we have received the feedback, which can help us improve the site, and we have given the visitor a link to the most direct path to get a response. At this point, through the button at the bottom, users are given the option of starting a survey where they can provide more detailed feedback. And this survey appears within that same component, still on the same page, and it collects a little more information about what the user thinks about the page and what they came here to do today. As I had mentioned before, that can be really important information. A little more about who they are and why they're using the website. And also, peeking up at the very bottom there is just an open field where they can tell us whatever they want. After that survey is our last and biggest opportunity to provide feedback, signing up for our user panel. Joe mentioned this before. This is a list currently about 800 people long that we reach out to when we want to test new features that we're developing on the site to make sure to, again, get those really relevant and important perspectives before we launch anything. Usually what will happen there is that we'll schedule a bunch of half-hour interviews and show them an in-progress dev site or even designs and ask them to complete a task while using that. And we'll see if it works or what improvements can be made. Now that we've seen how feedback is collected through the component, Joe's going to tell you a little bit about what happens to it.
Cool, thanks. Okay, so the feedback has been submitted, and now we need to get it to the author who manages the page. And while this isn't a technical presentation, we want to give you a small taste of what's happening behind the scenes. So it starts with a simple HTML form on Mass.gov, which submits to FormStack. At FormStack, whenever a submission comes in, a webhook is fired, which sends the data to an AWS database that we use to store our feedback and analytics data. And then we have an API built on top of that database to make the feedback available to Drupal, where the authors can see it. Some of you may wonder why we didn't choose to collect and store feedback directly in Drupal and instead chose to collect the data with FormStack and store it in our own database. And basically, on a large site like ours that gets a lot of traffic, we're really sensitive to security and performance needs, and managing the feedback outside of Drupal really helps us keep things a lot simpler on the site. And on our site, we actually don't have any forms on the site that anonymous visitors can submit, and visitors to the site aren't able to do anything that will let them save data on the site. So this eliminates a whole load of potential security and performance issues. And we also wanted to store the feedback data in our analytics database along with other performance data that's used to score pages, which I'll talk about in a moment. Okay, so how do we present the feedback data to authors in Drupal? There's 3 different ways that authors can see feedback data. First, they can see it for a specific page while they're editing the page. Second, we have a feedback manager tool within Drupal where they can access all feedback across the site and sort and filter that feedback. And finally, on the author homepage in our edit site, authors see a component that lists content that's not scoring well and needs attention. And as I show you the feedback interfaces, I'm going to use this page as an example. It's a page that shows where the state has stocked trout for people to catch in ponds and rivers. You may not have realized this is a state service, but the state's Division of Fisheries and Wildlife are putting several 100,000 fish in ponds every year. So this is our Drupal editing interface. We've worked to style it so it does look different than the default Drupal admin theme. You can see standard view, edit, delete, and revisions tabs here. And we have a few custom tabs that we've added, and one of them is the Analytics tab, and one of them is the Feedback tab. And when you click on the Analytics tab, you can see how well this content's performing. We score content on multiple factors, and one of them is user satisfaction, which is driven by the responses to this "Did you find what you were looking for?" question. And in this case, this page about trout stocking scores a 4 out of 4. So the fishermen are pretty happy, I'd say. And if we scroll down this page, we see some useful data. We measure page satisfaction in 2 ways. First, we look at the percent of no answers to the "Did you find?" question for this page, and we know what our averages are for each content type, and we factor that into coming up with a score for each page. And in this case, only 18% of visitors responded with a no answer, which is really good. And the other number we look at is the number of no answers per 1,000 page views. And this is a little bit more useful, I think, than the no percentage if you get very little feedback on a page. In this case, the page had 0.22 no answers per 1,000 page views, which is also really good. And at the very bottom, you can see like the total number of the total amount of feedback for the last month and the responses there. So as you can see, this page gets a fair amount of feedback. So in last 6 months, 457 responses.
People love fishing.
Yes. And the chart in the middle of the page shows these numbers over time so that authors can see if the changes they're making are having an effect. You can see that there is a weird spike on this page in February where people weren't quite as happy. Does anybody want to guess why there's a spike in February here?
Because they took the old data down and didn't have any new?
Maybe.
Yeah.
Any other thoughts?
Was it because they were late in posting the information?
Let's look.
Change the design.
Change the design? All right, let me show you.
and, it's to go into a certain place, and I'm like, where?
So basically, when I looked into this, because I was curious if I'm going to put up a screenshot with a spike, I better know what the spike's about. And it turns out that very few people are looking at this page in February. And so while this page gets a massive amount of traffic during the actual fishing season, you can see in some days it's getting 10,000 page views a day in April, close to 10,000 page views a day. But in February, it's getting almost nobody. So the people who are responding in April, there's a handful of people on the site saying, when are you going to post the trout stocking information? Like, they can't wait for it. It's February, but they want to get out there and go fishing. So it's because the reason why we have that spike is really because so few people were viewing the page, and the few that did respond said no. So it drove up the chart data. So actually, let me go back. All right, so once an author sees how things look on this analytics tab, they'll want to see what the actual feedback says. So at the top of this page, there's a feedback tab. And if they click that, you see the feedback for this page with the most recent feedback first. We show authors what the visitor found, and what we show the authors whether the visitor found what they wanted, and we show the actual feedback message. We allow visitors to enter a fairly long message, and we show only the first part here, and then there's a see more or show more expansion that lets them see the full message if it's really long. And if organizations allow visitors to request a response through the feedback component, and if a visitor asks for a response, we'll show that contact information just to the right of the message where you see those NAs. So in this case, no one's requesting a response, or in this case, actually, the organization doesn't allow a response for their content. And if the visitor took the follow-up survey, there'll be a yes in the final column on the right, and if you click that yes, it opens up the survey response directly below the feedback entry row. Most visitors don't do the secondary survey, but if they do, this can give some useful information to authors, especially additional information about what the visitor was trying to do. Now, one problem looking at feedback in the context of individual pages is that you can miss the big picture. So our authors need an easy way to see feedback that comes in on any page they manage, so they don't have to check pages one by one. And for that, we have our feedback manager. So the feedback manager tool lets authors see all the feedback for the entire site and filter it to see exactly what they want. The most common filters used here are the organization filter and the author filter. We also have an option that lets authors filter for feedback that requires a response. So in this way, they don't have to hunt around the site for feedback for which people are waiting for an answer. And we have one final way that helps authors find pages that probably need to be improved, and Colin will talk about that one.
So this is the content that needs attention component. And this is a way to surface content that, according to our metrics, could most stand to be improved to site authors. This appears on their homepage. They see it right after they log in. And what we're seeing here is a table of content that is rated a, is it?
3 and below.
3 and below, okay, yeah. It's that score that Joe was talking about before, which you can see in the score column there. So this is low scoring content, and it is ordered by page view. In the first column on the left, you can see page views per month. So the low scoring content that the most people are seeing is at the top of that list. Next in the table, we see the title of the content. After that is content type. We thought hard about what information would be valuable for site authors to see in this table. On our site, multiple pieces of content of a different type can sometimes be named similarly. So we thought that having the content type called out there would be very important for some authors. After that, the score. After that, the date that the content was last revised. can be super helpful for authors to know if this is something that they haven't touched for a year or for 6 months or for a month. And kind of in line with that, we have a snooze button, which everyone loves a snooze button. So what happens there is that that will make that piece of content disappear from this list for 4 weeks. So if a author has made an improvement to a page, but they haven't had many people or anyone use it yet, seeing it in this list is no longer helpful to them. So they can hit that snooze button, and after the 4 weeks are up, one of two things will happen. That content will either stand to be further improved and will show back up in this list, or it will have been improved enough that the content is scoring more highly and it no longer shows in this list. So that is how we're collecting feedback, what happens to it, and how our authors see it. And this has been up and running for a little while, and so we are going to talk about some of the outcomes.
Okay, so we get a lot of feedback from this Did You Find question. In a typical month, we get about 30,000 responses. And as you'd expect, pages with the most traffic are giving us the most feedback. And looking at the site overall, when we analyze the responses, we see about 40% of visitors who responded answer yes, and about 60% of visitors answered no. And in general, people are more likely to speak up when they're frustrated, so these percentages don't surprise us. And keep in mind that this doesn't mean that 60% of the people who view our pages are dissatisfied. Only a small percentage of visitors are giving us feedback. We also discovered that we tend to see higher no percentages on navigational pages, although the number of no's per 1,000 page views tends to be low, so we don't think these pages are necessarily performing badly. We think on navigational pages this happens because people are more likely to click off of these navigational pages and go somewhere else on the site, and they're less likely to click yes on these particular pages. And comparing responses to page views, we get about 1 no response per 1,000 page views on average. This varies a lot by content type and by individual page. And finally, about 1% of people on desktop submit feedback, about 0.5% submit on mobile. So it is a small number of people providing feedback, and on pages that get a lot of feedback, we can get really useful information still. So people report a lot of different things in the feedback component, but there are some things that we hear most often. A good number of people do exactly what we asked them to do, and they tell us what they expected to see on the page but didn't find, and a few of those things are listed up here. Some people will tell us about issues that have nothing to do. Some people will tell us about issues that are having to do with the state government service rather than the web page itself. So it may have nothing to do with the content. It's just an issue they're having with a state government service. And some people are also looking for contact information. We do have contact information on the website, but our hope is that visitors will find what they need on the site and not need to contact the state. And Colin will start telling us about some of the lessons we learned about UX and design issues.
So some of the feedback that we've gotten on this feedback component has highlighted some areas where we could improve. And so one of the things that we want to do is make the call to action to engage with the feedback unobtrusive. Because it's in the middle of the page and even can obscure a small amount of content on mobile. We're getting some accidental clicks to that side tab that I talked about before. And so we are looking at some alternate layouts for this. Right now, we're looking at the possibility of a horizontal button. This moves the clickable area of the call to action down lower, and it's less tall, so it's going to be obscuring less content and is less likely to be clicked, but it is still obscuring some amount of content, so maybe we'll find an even bigger improvement that we can make there. You want to make sure you're not removing users from their journey when you ask them for feedback. Because once users click this tab, they're scrolled to the bottom of the page. Some users are losing their place. So we are thinking about a modal window for that, where they are not scrolled anywhere else. They can see that they're still in the same place when they clicked on the feedback tab behind the modal window there, and they can exit out of it or finish their journey and be returned right back to where they were. You want to make sure that the distinction between the feedback component and the page itself is clear. So we have some page types that are forms, and the difference between the end of those pages and the beginning of this feedback form is not always clear to users. So we're looking to make that distinction more obvious. We are considering adding some sort of a header to the feedback component that may make it more clear, or maybe we'll find an even bigger improvement for that as well. You want to make sure that you're collecting data every step of the way. So when users use our feedback form, they hit yes or no that they found what they're looking for. And then that brings up that input field that you saw where it asks them what they were looking for. And we realized that we could be collecting even more data if we measured that user input on that yes or no as soon as they clicked it, and not waiting for them to decide whether or not to fill in that input field and then hit submit. You want to make sure that your question structure isn't limiting. 7% of people tried to submit the form without clicking yes or no. So that is a little chunk of more data that we could be collecting. And Joe, I think you want to talk about this last bullet here.
Sure. On page load times, when we first deployed this survey, we used a form stack JavaScript embed to put it on the page. We noticed that this did slow page load times and left us vulnerable if form stack had issues or made changes. And so we later changed this to render the survey using static HTML that submits to form stack. So we no longer have a dependency on code that could change while we're using it. Let's see. Oh, you got a couple of...
Yep.
Okay. So we've learned a lot by using this feedback component. Regarding the survey questions themselves, the way we've integrated them into our database, into our API, and the Drupal interface makes it a little bit of a pain to change the survey questions because we have to touch all of those places. So one of the things we've learned is that we need to find a way to improve flexibility. And regarding the feedback visitors leave, it's sometimes not easy to analyze. So it's great if you get a dozen people saying the same thing about a page, but sometimes you get a dozen people saying a dozen different things about a page. So we'd really like to find better ways to help authors interpret and understand feedback. One of the things that we've tried is word clouds, and that was fairly successful, and we're looking at the possibility of using machine learning to categorize feedback. Sometimes we see feedback that makes a lot of sense, but the issue can't be solved with a quick content change. As I mentioned earlier, sometimes it suggests an improvement to a state program or service, and in this case, authors can work with the subject matter experts in their organization to surface these issues. In a lot of cases, those are not quick things to solve. And finally, authors need to read and use the feedback for it to be effective. So Most of our authors spend only a small percentage of their time working on the website. We have a small group of content analysts at Mass.gov that look for pages that aren't performing well and will reach out to authors to suggest changes. We do spend a lot of time training and guiding authors to help them make the site the best it can be.
And also, we are collecting and sorting this feedback at a page level, and that is not how all of the feedback that is left for us. That's the reality is that people are leaving feedback a lot more broad than that pretty often. So we need to think really broadly when we're looking at and considering this feedback, and maybe find a way to reflect that broadness in the way that this feedback is stored and sorted.
Cool. All right, that's the end of our presentation. So thank you for your interest in Mass.gov and the way we deal with feedback. And we would also love to have you follow Mass.gov Digital and Last Call Media on Twitter. And we'd be happy to answer any questions.
So you did say you get about 1% of feedback submission through desktop and 0.5 through mobile.
Mm-hmm.
When you're looking at those feedbacks, can you determine whether or not where they're coming from? And by that I mean, let's say you get 50 feedbacks that keep saying I can't find this particular source. Now, using that, can you identify whether or not it's a desktop issue or a mobile issue?
It's a good question. We have the data that tells us whether each piece of feedback is desktop or mobile. We don't expose that to authors right now, so that's a potential improvement we could make. Some authors have suggested that we do that. There's some other data that we collect that authors would also like. For example, the time that feedback was submitted. Currently, we just show the date. Some authors want to correlate what someone said with what's going on at a particular time with their systems, and so they've asked for the time. So there are things we can do to improve the way we render feedback for authors.
And sorry, one more. And the redesign that you proposed for the feedback button, the horizontal design, was that a redesign for the desktop or was that for the mobile or both?
The mock-up that we looked at was for desktop, and that's in just the very initial stages of reconsidering some improvements for that. So we haven't yet thought through how that would look on mobile, but we would fully consider that before moving forward with it for sure.
And we used to have actually a floating button similar to that in the lower right corner, and we did have complaints that obscured content as well. So we have to be really careful the way we implement something like that.
Yeah, and I didn't mention it, but another thing that we can consider is the behavior of the button. Maybe people don't see it all the time. Maybe it's triggered by certain behavior, and that would be a way to minimize its obstruction of content also. So
I have a question about this decision to put the feedback in a separate database outside of Drupal, and then that makes sense because you can put it combined with analytics. How do you get it back into the form that the authors see? Is there an API, or how does that?
There is an API, so the question is, how do we get the data back into Drupal for authors to see? So once the data is in the database, we have an API that's running on top of that database data, and Drupal is hitting that API and pulling the data in to render it on the screen. So every time you're using any of the interfaces we have in Drupal, it's making a call out to that API to get the data and pull it in.
And the other one is, has anyone ever said that form popping up at your first time you hit the site is annoying? Has anyone said that?
We have heard people say that. So that's the site-based feedback related to 4C. And so we're looking at that, and it is something that people do report. Some people are frustrated by that, and we don't want people to be frustrated, so it's something that we're aware of.
And if somebody says no,
I think that means that they won't get that pop-up again for some number of days.
Correct. If someone closes that 4C pop-up, they won't see it, I think, for 90 days, or it'll be gone for quite a long time.
Okay.
And if you say you don't want to take it, you'll also won't get asked again for 90 days.
That's good. Yeah.
As if you have to visit the site every day for your job or something. That would be super
That'd be
annoying.
annoying.
Cool. Anyone else? Great.
Thank you very much.
Thanks so much, everyone.